Welcome to Jeepney Jazz Talks, Bakit kahit di Dumarating, Music and Stage During the Japanese Occupation with Dr. Ricardo Trota Jose. Thanks for joining us, whether you're here on site at Ayala Museum or online via Zoom or Facebook Live. Good afternoon again, and a warm welcome to all of you. My name is Charlene, and I'll be the host for today's event. We are so thrilled to launch the second leg of Jeepney Jazz, the music education and appreciation program of Filipinas Heritage Library, during Jazz Appreciation Month. Last year, we explored the theme of indigenous legacies, and for this set, we'll be 20s to the 1950s, or the American era of jazz in the Philippines. Today's talk provides the entertainment scene of those decades with a special focus on jazz. Let me introduce our speaker. Ricardo Trota Jose is a professor emeritus in the History Department of the University of the Philippines, Deli. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degree in history at UP and University of Foreign Studies. This in military and diplomatic history with a Japanese occupation of the Philippines. He has published widely in various journals and books. Among his major publications are the Philippine Army, 1935 to 1942, with Ateneo de Manila Press, and Volume 7 on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines of the multi-volume Kaysaysayan set of Reader's Digest in 1998. He co-edited with Japanese colleagues The Philippines Under Japan, Occupation Policy and Reaction in 1999. And his latest work is on the Philippine guerrilla resistance movement in Mindanao and Sulu, The Guerrilla Days in the Philippine South, co-authored with Cesar Pobre in 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a longtime collaborator with FHL, Dr. Ricardo Trota Jose.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. It affords us escape from the heat outside, but it also is, it's a Saturday afternoon, and for some of us, Saturday afternoons are better spent doing other things. So thank you for coming this afternoon, and I hope to take you on a trip back through time into a period that we are now commemorating the 80th anniversary of. So 80 years ago, the Philippines was under Japanese occupation. The Philippines will be liberated, or the Americans will return only later this year, and the fierce fighting will take place next year. So we are commemorating this particular era, and people are still around to remember this. And when I was asked to give this talk quite some time ago, my first reaction was really, if the focus is jazz, there was very little jazz during the Japanese occupation because the Japanese banned anything American. That things that were jazz was very American, and that was definitely a no-no for them. But anyway, this is a very interesting story, and I hope to, I've interspersed it with a number of musical excerpts. The one that we heard playing before the national anthem is something that we now consider the presidential march for the Philippines. It's called Mabuhay, the Mabuhay March. It was composed way back in 1931 by Tirso Cruz Sr. Now, his grandson is still alive today, Tirso Cruz III. I think we're familiar with him as a movie star. And even his son, Tirso Cruz IV, is involved in music and other things. So it's a very musical family. But anyway, music is very much a part of Philippine life. As we saw in the national anthem, you see that the band that played the original national anthem in 1898 still exists today. And we are surrounded by music every part of the Philippines, every day of our lives. So basically, music is very much a part of the Philippines. So even during times of crisis, times of war, times of Japanese occupation, or for that matter, American occupation and so forth. Music has always played a significant role in Philippine life. So let's move. Okay, this is all right. So when we look at music, when we look at music in Philippine life, it's a major part of Philippine culture. It spans the centuries. Some of the music that we hear now and fairly often are actually music that was composed 100 years ago or so. We're looking back into indigenous music, looking back into our roots, and very proud of this. So definitely, music is something that we can't do without. We are a musical people. We enjoy music. We play music. Notice just how popular song and dance are in TV and even local governments. How many of us were involved in song fests and stuff like that? It's something that's very much a part of our life. And that spans centuries. Before the Spaniards came, we were already musical at that time. The Spaniards came in, they introduced new musical instruments, they exposed us to religious music and so forth. But we continue to keep our own traditions there. So in one sense, someone said, music is something that shapes the mind by shaping the ear. Because what we hear shapes what we think. Or conversely, music is an expression of our own character. So if our mind is shaped by the ear, I think very much so also the ear shapes the mind. So it's something that works both ways. There are many different levels of music that we can look into, and I will not be able to dwell on this in this afternoon's talk. We'll focus only on a limited number of engagements. There's music for pure entertainment, stuff that we just want to enjoy ourselves, have fun with, and so forth. Music that doesn't have any real deep meaning, but we just want to express our joy at being alive and so forth. There's also music that's motivational, that's nationalistic, that's patriotic. And that has been there since time immemorial. Then, with the Spaniards, of course, came religious Catholic music, and there's also military music as well. Military music, brass bands and stuff. We have very distinguished composers, and in fact, at one point in time, our own brass bands were world-renowned. So these are all long-standing traditions. Local bands, musicians, not only locally, but also across the seas. You go abroad, you go to Indonesia, for example, you go to Malaysia or Singapore, and some of the people playing in those hotels are Filipinos. And you go as well to the United States, we are very musical all over the world. And yet, it's not just for entertainment. We also have used music as an anti-colonial venue. This has been an expression of nationalism, of patriotism. It has been a way to challenge the order that some people were not able to change. So it's an expression of the soul. Things have changed through time. The Spanish influence brought in things like the zarzuela, Western musical patterns, Western musical instruments, and so forth. And yet, the Filipino idioms continued through time. There is a nationalistic tradition. Julio Nakpil, for example, composed music in the 1890s, which we're only rediscovering now. Theater was also seen as a very important part of developing our consciousness. Even today, students use theater to make people aware of current events. During the early American period, there were those playwrights who were called the seditious playwrights because they wrote plays that seemed harmless on the outside. They were musical, and yet they actually had very anti-American themes hidden behind. So the American government even had to ban them for a while because they were considered dangerous. And yet later on, by the 1920s, the American influence would bring in jazz. And it was something that we also excelled in. We were fantastic. Jazz is a great deal of improvisation, and we are fantastic improvisers. So insofar as becoming world-renowned, we mentioned the bands, as was shown in the national anthem video. The band that originally played the first national anthem is still very much around. The descendants of those musicians are still playing the way they did in 1898. We also have, still existing, the Philippine Constabulary Band, which became world-renowned. It traveled to the United States, and it performed in the United States as early as 1904, and it was well known around the world. Trends in the 1920s and the early 1930s would come up with different perspectives. And I've mentioned there's religious music, there's martial music, there's patriotic music, and we mentioned jazz. Of course, all throughout this time also there is the more serious music, Western classical music. So we were also exposed to symphonies and concertos, chamber music, choral music, and all of that. And in the 1920s, with the introduction of jazz and vaudeville, again, the vaudeville pattern was coming, became very popular in the 1920s. Those who were involved in classical music felt that this was not good. This was sin music. It was evil. It was too fleshy. In a way, this actually goes back through time. And if you remember when Johann Strauss Sr. was composing his waltzes, even the Europeans were aghast when men were holding women's waists and so forth. That was something shocking to people. And in the 1920s, the classical musical people in Manila felt that nobody should get involved in jazz. It's too dangerous. It's too sensual. It's something that doesn't work. And even the Philippine Constabulary Band, they wanted to try experimenting with the latest jazz crazes. And the commanding officer said, no, you're not going to go down to that level. You have to stay on the classical, more formal level. So you see this, actually, it's interesting. You have these contradictions, you have these different perspectives, but all of this is really music of the time. And one person who did try to bridge a gap was Nicanor Abelardo. Nicanor Abelardo studied in the United States, but he tried to bridge Western musical tradition with Philippine traditional songs, that is, kundimans. He combined the kundiman and merged it with Western symphonic ideas and came out with Philippine symphonic music. And that's why the UP College of Music is named Abelardo Hall. So his role in shaping Philippine music at that time, this is the more formal level, it's classical, but it is very Filipino. And so he was very important in shaping Philippine music at the time. Music was also taught in schools. We had something called the Progressive Philippine Music Series. And this is the intermediate grades book. Actually, this is for grade 5 and grade 6. And when one looks into this, it is a mixture of Philippine folk songs, American songs, European songs even, French and Scandinavian and so forth. It's an interesting book, a compilation of music from around the world, but more especially music from the Philippines. There's music from the mountain province, there's music from Mindanao, there's music from every part of the Philippines. And this is what not our children, this is what our great-grandparents had studied in school. I'm not sure if any of you would have taken this kind of thing when you took up music in schools, but it was something that was standard in the 1920s and the 1930s. So Filipinos were also exposed not only to local music, but also to international musical trends. Now, we had mentioned jazz, but in the 1920s, jazz was coming to the Philippines in a big scale. Our musicians learned jazz. Again, many of our musicians, as you probably know, don't read music. They hear something and they can play it right away. So these people are usually self-educated, or their parents had educated them. But again, we're very musical. So Filipinos pick up a theme, they know how to play it right away. And they can improvise. And that's the nature of jazz. So this guy, Luis Borromeo, he was considered at his time the king of Philippine jazz. He went abroad, was exposed to American jazz, and when he came back to the Philippines in the 1920s, he felt that, why can't we do this here? So he created his own jazz band, and he composed a number of early jazz compositions in the Philippines. And so he became very famous for doing this, performing jazz in the Philippines. When he became very famous, he changed his name, and his stage name was Borromeo Lu. So the classical name was Luis Borromeo, but his stage name was Borromeo Lu. So people from the 1920s and the 1930s actually remember Borromeo Lu rather than Luis Borromeo. Now, the opening tune that we heard earlier, before the national anthem, was composed by this guy. This is Tirso Cruz the third. This is Tirso Cruz Senior. It's the grandfather of Tirso Cruz the third, or great grandfather of the fourth. So he was famous for conducting a band in the Manila Hotel. So on the right side, you see the advertisement to the Manila Hotel Band of Tirso Cruz. So he was a dance. He played a dance orchestra. He composed his own tunes, very much in the jazz routine. And in fact, he became very famous for Mabuhay, or the Mabuhay March, which was played earlier on, which still lives on today as the presidential march in the Philippines. But again, this kind of thing was looked down upon by the upper class. They said, this is still, it's popular music, it's not traditional, it's something that is too sensual, it's dangerous to the youth. Another of the mainstays of our pre-war vaudeville world and the pre-war jazz world was Cathy de la Cruz, who is now considered a national artist. So she was one of those who was performing on stage in the 1920s. These were dance numbers, leggy numbers in a sense, very emotional songs that she was singing on stage. But she did pioneer in developing a Philippine style. And she was well renowned for that. And she had her own troupe of other girls who were dancing with her on stage. You might be familiar, if you're old enough to remember, there was a TV comedian by the name of Chichay in the 1960s. She was part of Cathy de la Cruz group. And also, well, there were quite a number of others who also became famous in their own right. So whether the upper class people were frowning upon jazz, jazz was here to stay, and popular music was here. It could not be censored, it could not be controlled, it was something that was living a life of its own. Oh. Okay, here. What's interesting is that while Filipino musicians were making a name for themselves here in the Philippines, not only in the Manila Hotel, but in the other big hotels as well, the big theaters in Manila and outside Manila as well, Filipino musicians were also making their names in Japan. So this was in the 1920s. And you will see here two advertisements for hotels in Japan which prided themselves on having Filipino musicians. One is in Yokohama, one is in Tokyo. And the spelling perhaps of, what was this, Bonifacio became Bonifacio, but newly arrived in, these are Filipinos indeed. So yes, they were making themselves, they were making a name for themselves, not only here, but also in Japan of all places. Most probably they were doing the same thing in China, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Jakarta and Singapore as well. But it's just that we did some research on Japan and said, oh, the Filipinos were making a name for themselves in the Japanese hotels, particularly introducing American jazz. Now, the thing was, okay, that was okay for the time being. Now, while the vaudeville really worked on stage, these were live performances. In a sense, we'd say the zarzuela, which was a musical opera type of thing that was presented during the Spanish period. By the 1920s and the 1930s, that was challenged by radio and movies. So radio was coming on, and you were now having radio broadcasts, and the theaters that were coming up at that time were now beginning to show Hollywood movies. In the 1920s, these movies were silent movies, and therefore they needed a musical accompaniment. And there we fit in perfectly again. Even if the movies were Hollywood movies, you had Filipino musicians emoting with the scenes that were showing on those black and white movies, love themes or love scenes in the theater. You would have the music really making people cry. And if you have cowboys and Indians chasing, the movies, the songwriters, the artists, the pianists, the little band on stage, they would capture the emotions very well. So that fit in very, very well. The thing was, by the 1930s, the silent movies were giving way to sound movies, or talkies. And so now you have these people no longer with jobs because the zarzuela had gone out of style. The vaudeville was going out of style also. And what was more interesting was the movies. Now, not only did we have Hollywood movies, but we also had our own movie industries, some of which companies are still around today. So these movies would now hire some of these musicians because the movies themselves would become semi-musical, and they always needed musical backgrounds. So those artists who were in the silent movie era would be hired by the movie companies, and they would begin performing for recording purposes. And we have a new batch of composers to compose for movies. People like S.S. Suarez, Restu Umali, among others. They would be composing almost exclusively for movies. They would continue to be important composers even after the war. But again, that issue that we mentioned earlier, the serious music versus sin music, that continued on in the 1930s. And then again, you have the foreign music, Western classical music, or even American music, versus the more indigenous. And that's why we have Abelardo trying to bridge the gap also. Now, by the 1930s, we have new things coming up, and among them were a whole new series of theaters, very modern theaters. Very few of them remain today, but they were world-class theaters. Some of them began to advertise that they were air-conditioned. Now, for today's world, of course, that's very important. Imagine going to a theater without air conditioning, just fans. But so some of these movie houses now began to say air-conditioned, and those began to appeal to Filipinos going there. Now, 1930s also saw with it the advent of the Philippine Commonwealth. This is very interesting because in 1935, the Philippines was given a promise that after 10 years, the Americans would recognize Philippine independence. So 1935, after 10 years, in 1946, the Philippines would be recognized as an independent state. And out of that would come a slew of music that would try to capture this new era, a sense of pride, a sense of optimism that the Philippines is going to be independent, and therefore let's capture our spirit in national compositions. People like Antonio Molina, Antonino Benaventura would come out and compose music that reflected that era. The Manila Symphony Orchestra, which was born in the 1920s, this would be the paragon of the classical music thing. And they performed in one of the new theaters of that time, the Metropolitan Theater. That was somewhat like the CCP of today. It was the center of classical music, formal performances, and so forth. And the Manila Symphony Orchestra performed in the Metropolitan Theater. And in the late 1930s, you had the resident conductor die. He died suddenly. And they needed a replacement for him. And they found a replacement in, of all places, he was at Dachau at that time. He was a Jew who was scheduled for execution at some future time. And people realized realized that this was a promising conductor, that he should not be killed in the gas chambers, and that he should be brought to the Philippines. So he was taken out of Dachau and brought to the Philippines, and he became the resident conductor of the Manila Symphony Orchestra. He had a very far-reaching idea of how the music was to reach not only people in the Metropolitan Theater, but to bring it out. So his idea was to make the orchestra go out of the theater and reach out to people. In 1941, he actually brought the Manila Symphony Orchestra to Baguio in a couple of performances there, precisely to reach out to the people. Today, the Manila Symphony Orchestra still exists, but it's quite different from the old one. And they also do try to reach out to the young people. They hold concerts in malls nowadays. So you have this kind of continuing tradition in that sense of bringing the music, serious music, to the people. But to the younger people, what was more interesting to them were the current dance crazes or the current musical crazes in the States, which were represented by things like the tango, the rumba, and to the really young ones, the boogie woogie. which was risque at that time. It was too dangerous. It was too sexy. It was something that the parents didn't want their students to learn. UP was one of those which had students who were dancing. There was a pictorial in 1941 showing UP students dancing the latest boogie woogie craze, and the parents were always against this. They felt this is our students, our children should not be doing this. But again, you cannot. I mean, it's like today. Will you tell your children to stop listening to the current crazes over the radio or Spotify or what have you nowadays? So again, it has its life. It has its own life. But well, just to continue on, while this is going on, we see a classical music or a formal music trend, and you have a popular music trend going on. Interestingly enough, even Quezon was very proud to dance the tango. So he didn't care if he was criticized for being too sensual and all that, but he was an excellent tango dancer. And others wanted to copy him as well. But to others, the young people, that was for the older generation. So let's go to the younger ones, the boogie woogie, and the others were more interesting then. So this was the Metropolitan Theater shortly after it was completed. So again, this was the cultural center of its day, filled with artworks outside and inside the theater. Fortunately, the reconstruction of the theater has been very faithful to the original plans, and you can go there today, and it has recaptured much of the spirit of the old Metropolitan Theater. But again, this was again the formal music, and this was for formal presentations, not so much for more popular stuff. So we'd look at other theaters like this. This is Ideal Theater, or Ideal Theater, or as people were pronouncing it then, Ideal. And this no longer exists anymore. This has been taken over by the one of the LRT stations. But this was one of the more popular theaters at that time. And one thing about this was that the theaters also doubled as stage. So they didn't just show movies, but they also showed stage presentations. And we'll see that that becomes very important during the Japanese occupation, because they will really be able to serve as drawers of audiences during that time. Another of the early or 1930s movie houses, this is Lyric Theater. This is in the Escolta. This was for the higher class people. So of course, Escolta was for the upper class people, and the movie houses in Rizal Avenue for the middle class and so forth. Then there were the older theaters, which continued to exist from the earlier periods of time, made of wood. But again, this I'm not sure if this exists. I think this has been torn down or is in the process of being torn down. There were two in the Escolta, and I know that they are giving way to other buildings. This is what Rizal Avenue looked like in the 1930s. You'll see the Ideal Theater there. On the right side, you would have the State Theater, and you'd see the LRT is not there yet, so traffic is not very much. There's a parade going on at this time. And so it was something that people could meet in. It's something that people could be seen. And it was something that people from different walks of life met. Now, this is the other side of this. Now, if you have the movie houses, and if you have the upper class theaters and all of that, there were also dance halls, or cabarets, as they were called. And this was one of the biggest ones, not only in Manila, not only in the Philippines. This was reputed to be one of the biggest ones in the whole of Asia. This was the Santa Ana Cabaret. And there were taxi dancers, I mean, women who danced with men, and they served good food and that kind of thing. So it was one of the, depending on what level you were from, you could say this is a fun place. Or the others would say, this is the den of iniquity. This is full of sin. So you look at people who are writing about Manila in that time, and they say either this is a very good place to be in, or this is a place not to be seen in. So This is another of those. This is a little farther out now. This was a dance hall outside Cavite called Dreamland. Looks like a barn. Doesn't look very interesting actually. No? But this catered to particularly U.S. Navy sailors when they came in with their ships in Cavite Navy Yard. And so this is what it looked like inside. And you see the sailors dancing with women. And what's interesting here is you look at the dance band above. So it's Dreamland, and this is where latest trends and the latest crazes were played for Americans, and when the Americans were not there, for the local Filipinos who were there. Okay, we talked about Lou Borromeo or Borromeo Lou. Now he took advantage of the fact also that the Commonwealth had been declared, so he declared a march. He created this march for the the hymn for the Philippine Commonwealth. A lot of important composers did compose music for that particular era, and another of the big composers here, the Quezon March. There were at least 2 versions of this that actually came out during that time. So people were really using music. They were capitalizing on music. They were using it basically to make people happy or using it for their own ends. This is the music for So this is the score. This is the orchestral score for Mabuhay, the Mabuhay March. And again, it was Tirso Cruz Sr. who composed that. I'll give you more information on that recording later on. It has a very sentimental link with myself, but let's leave that to later. And let's move on still further. Okay, so it seems like things were moving on well. We had music inspiring people, music making people dance, and so forth. But, okay, nightlife, this is Rizal Avenue at night. You have the big theaters all lighted up. This is what Rizal Avenue and other parts of Manila looked like at night. Everything was lit up. People were so impressed by Manila, how modern Manila was with all the street lights out there. And if you say New York was a city that didn't sleep, Manila slept, but it stayed awake for quite a lot of time. So it had the lights like this. Now, unfortunately, all of this would come to a very abrupt end. War would start. And World War II started in the Philippines on December 8, 1941, and that brought about an immediate rush to defend the Philippines. Bombings would take place. Manila would be bombed, Baguio would be bombed, Davao would be bombed, but young Filipinos would race to the recruitment centers and join the army. And some people actually composed music to help those fight the war. One of them was a young Filipino by the name of Raul Manglapus, who composed a victory march in December of 1941. Of course, to say victory in December 1941, nobody knew how long the war was going to how long it was going to last, but Raul Manglapus did write this. For those of you who are not too familiar with Raul Manglapus, of course, he became senator, he was Secretary of Foreign Affairs during the Cory administration era, but he composed another piece of music that is still being played today, and this is in Ateneo. Raul Manglapus was an Ateneo student, and one of the compositions he composed was Fly, Blue Eagle, Fly. Or you hear this sometimes in the UAAP games, especially when Ateneo wins, they sing that. And most people don't remember that it was Manglapus who composed that before the war. So anyway, Manglapus did compose this victory march very early in the war, but Bataan and Corregidor came in and the Japanese occupation broke the peacetime world. So from the bright lights of pre-war Manila, Manila was plunged into darkness. The same position that the camera was in now took a picture of Manila under blackout. Even with under the blackout, the moon provides enough light to see what's there anyway. But anyway, the Japanese would come in. And this is Manglapus.
You brown-skinned man of might, come from plain and hill. Like the day is come to fight, is the hour to kill. You and I will in this battle do or die with our cry of victory. Sons of toil and liberty, by that oath you swore.
Okay, so imagine that even in the midst of the blackout and in the midst of the bombings, you have people singing that and roused to fighting spirit. Imagine he's saying there, do or die, we're going to fight, and so forth. No, very patriotic. Manglapus would later join the guerrillas. He would be captured by the Japanese, tortured in Fort Santiago, and maimed, but he would realize that that was a passing event. And later on, he became good friends with the Japanese after the war. Now, when the Japanese took over, they brought in a different cultural policy entirely. One was to demonize the US and its allies, including Great Britain, China under the Chiang Kai-shek regime, and also the other European powers. So the US in particular and its ideals were to be demonized. These were evil, these were bad. And that meant things like democracy, the basic freedoms we had learned before the war, these were now to be brought out, removed, swept under the rug, and so forth. And in that place, Japan would be number one. Japan would take over, would provide the spiritual renaissance for Asia, and so forth. And in particular, the Japanese wanted to bring the Philippines back to Asia, rediscover its own roots. They felt that the Americans had made the Filipinos lose our roots. We'd become too Americanized, jazz, Hollywood, and all of that. That was something that the Japanese wanted to undo. So no to jazz, no to Hollywood. Hollywood movies were still kept in the theaters for the first few months because there was nothing to replace them with. So the theaters continued to show reruns, and people were so bored of these already because imagine seeing reruns on your TV or in Netflix all the time. There's nothing new coming out there. You become bored. And so even though the movies were still American, they were simply old movies. Jazz, the Japanese said, no, no jazz. Even the Philippine national anthem was banned. The Philippine national anthem was too patriotic. It was something that might be used against the Japanese. And so the Philippine national anthem was totally banned for at least a year and a half. Instead, what the Japanese would allow would be Japanese marches and Japanese songs. And the theaters were reopened to give a sense of normalcy. Although that normalcy was only fleeting, and again, you would be watching movies, but you had to be home before the lights were out, before the blackouts, and so forth. So instead of American music, for a while then, we heard a lot of Japanese music, played by bands, played in the radios. And this is again Rizal Avenue. You see the theaters there. And this is a band playing a Japanese march. Okay, it's a long piece. I just took the main melody out for that. People of that generation could remember not only the music, they could also sing the lyrics, even though they didn't understand what they meant. When I was a young student, I also learned the lyrics by heart, and I sang it with my old colleagues in the department. We'd wind up singing the same thing, and no one knew what we were singing about. It's like singing the Voltes 5 song and not knowing what the lyrics meant. So yeah, so there was music like this. The tunes were very catchy. Well, they were not American tunes, definitely, but these were some things that were easy to remember, and people who lived through that era would still remember them. I remember when I asked my mother to play some songs for me way back 40 years ago, and she said, I remember this, and she played some more music that was not on my music sheets. So this was something that was pervasive in the occupied areas. The bands again played everywhere. Here they are in the Rizal Auditorium, the Rizal Coliseum. Even in prison camp. This is in Capas, this is in Camp O'Donnell, the Philippine prisoner of war camp, and they were also playing music there to try to inspire Filipinos. Now here is where we see Philippine ingenuity coming out. And again, you have Filipinos managing to survive during periods of great distress and periods of great conflict. It's said that in one of the marches in Camp O'Donnell itself, the band played a different tune. It was not sanctioned by the Japanese. The Japanese didn't know what it was, but they said, this is a very good march. And they applauded when the band passed the stage. Later on, they asked, what march was that? Oh, that was John Philip Sousa's The Stars and Stripes Forever. And he said, okay, that is banned, no more. They cannot play that march anymore. It's American. So we shift to the Japanese marches. So they introduced music books. There were 4 of them that came out in full book-length capacity. One was called the Music Book Series, and the other was called the Japanese Song Series, which contained not only the martial music, but it also contained Japanese folk songs, and it introduced Filipinos at least. Remember the music book that we saw earlier, the progressive music book? This replaced that. And here you would have Japanese music, again, military music of that time, but also Japanese traditional folk songs. So it was a mixture of them. And that's on the right side, the Japanese song series. The one on the left is a little more open. It just says music book series. You had a number of Philippine compositions here already, but they were the commissioned marches of that time. So we were exposed to the Japanese compositions, and whether we wanted to or not, we had to listen to them. Here is the music of another march that came out at that time, the People's March, Kokumin Shingunka. And again, the use of the flag made it very patriotic. And another one, the earlier tune that we heard, Aikoku Koshinkyoku, or Patriotic March. This was it, issued in small leaflet size and given to anyone within reach. So they were made available. People could study them. People could play them on the piano. And for a larger concept, Asia, not just the Philippines, not just Japan, but there were compositions like this, which was not only for Japan, but for the whole of Asia as well. So this was to try to replace jazz and all the American stuff we had before the war. Western music was still okay, as long as it was German or Italian. So German, Beethoven, okay. Beethoven is ally, okay. The Italians, okay. Rossini, the operas of Rossini, okay also. No, but Americans, old folks at home, other American classics, no longer. So the Filipinos were encouraged to compose for the new order. Now the new order was something that was called Bagong Pilipinas. Almost the first time the Japanese entered Manila, they started talking not in terms of Pilipinas, but Bagong Pilipinas. Everything was coached in Bagong Pilipinas. And contests were held not only for composers, but also for artists. So there were contests for singers, there were contests for young pianists. My father was discovered in 1943 in one of those music contests. And for the composers, they were asked to compose for specific themes, as much as possible using Filipino tradition and Filipino spirit. Some would say we'll combine the Japanese identity with the Filipino identity and come up with a new kind of musical theme. Others, however, would try to utilize the music to carry out other messages. This was all carried out under very, very strict censorship. I mentioned earlier that the national anthem was banned would not play the national anthem. Interestingly, we'd say, well, didn't the Americans do that also? During the early American period, they banned the American flag, the Philippine flag and all of that. So the Japanese did the same thing. They banned the Philippine national anthem, the Philippine flag should not be shown, and so forth. So we had to continue, we had to work under things, we had to work under these conditions. One Filipino composed the march for a Japanese general, the Marcha General Wachi. Now, General Wachi was the second most powerful Japanese general in the Philippines throughout most of the war. He took care of the military administration, general affairs, and so forth. So this was a composition from that era. But others would compose more nationalistic music. Since the national anthem was banned, a contest was held to conduct to come up with the lyrics of a new song, a song that would celebrate the rebirth of a new Philippines. And that song, the lyrics easily were won by a Bulaqueño, Catalino Dionisio, as you see here. And problem there was you had to give it music. And so while you have the lyrics, very nationalistic, who was going to compose the music? Now, when the war started and the Japanese came in, Herbert Zipper, the conductor of the Manila Symphony Orchestra, said, really, the Japanese are not going to use the Manila Symphony Orchestra at all. I will hide the instruments. Nobody will play for the Japanese. So the Manila Symphony Orchestra did not exist during the Japanese period. It could not come out in the open. Its musicians had to eat, however, and if you look at the rosters of the wartime orchestra, you do find several of them also playing for the new orchestra that came out. But again, here, you have the lyrics, and who was tasked to compose the music for this? A young Filipino composer by the name of Felipe Padilla de Leon. He was told to compose this literally under gunpoint. Here are the lyrics, write something to make this nice. And so, when is the deadline? Come out with it next week. And they knocked on his door every day. Tapos na ba? Tapos na ba? Is it finished? And literally, the bayonets were pointing at him, write something. And so he was very, very pressured to come up with something. How can I do something that will echo Philippine nationalistic identity and not be censored by the Japanese? If I use the Philippine national anthem, the Japanese will see through it right away. So what did he do? He reversed parts of the Philippine national anthem. He changed the notes, but he said this is still the national anthem, and then he put a couple of phrases in it that were really from the national anthem. So to those of us who know the national anthem by heart, if you listen to this particular music, you'd see, there, that's from the national anthem. You recognize it right away. So the lyrics were good. If they were composed at any other time, then the music was very catchy as well. So this particular music, we'll listen to a part of it here. Okay, so that was the musical part of that song, and that took over from the national anthem from December of 1942 until the national anthem was again allowed to be played in 1943, when the Second Republic was established by the Japanese. Now, what's interesting about this particular tune is it's very catchy. Again, I said there are phrases in it. It's not in this part. It comes in the later part of the composition. There is a part really from the national anthem. You recognize it right away. But the lyrics are quite powerful. Tindig aking inang bayan, stand. And the last part of it was gumawa, bumuo at magbata. So you have to produce, you have to work hard, and you have to be young. The thing is, unfortunately, since this was something that Filipinos were forced to sing and to study and memorize, we know what happens when we're forced to memorize things. We do the work, we do something else. So instead of Tindig Aking Inang Bayan, people actually sang Tindig, I cannot say the word here, Pi Inang Bayan. And the last part of it where it said gumawa, bumuo at magbata, they said gumawa ng bata. So again, our Filipino sense of humor is always there. And so again, this was something, perhaps given a more ideal setting, it would have been a very good thing. But and when you listen to what Felipe Padilla de Leon was saying, his rationale for composing this and all of that, it's all very rational, very logical, very nationalistic. But if you're forced to study it, of course, you know what we'll do. You know what we do about those things. Okay, this is Felipe Padilla de Leon. He's putting the finishing touches on the music sheet. Not seen perhaps here are the Japanese guards behind him. And this was when it was presented for the first time to the public at large at the Metropolitan Theater. So this is in the Metropolitan Theater. That's a large chorus that sang it in public for the first time. The audience is here. If you go to the Metropolitan Theater, you'll recognize it. It's the same structure today. But the Metropolitan Theater was used for official functions, things like this. Now, in 1943, the Japanese declared the Philippines independent. They wanted to beat the Americans to it. Remember, the Americans said, we'll become independent in 1946. So the Japanese said, we'll undercut that. We will declare you independent first in 1943. So they declared the Philippines independent, at least on paper, but in practice, the Japanese sentries still stayed on the street. Now, the Second Republic was under President Jose P. Laurel. And it's during that time that we see the government taking a more Filipino-conscious stance. Not so much pro-Japanese as in the earlier year and a half, but this time a stronger Filipino presence, a stronger Filipino identity. So among other things, we have the Pambansang Awit ng Pilipinas, now being sung in Tagalog. Now, this is important because before the war, we were singing the Philippine national anthem only in English. The original composition was in Spanish, of course, but during the American period, we were singing Land of the Morning, Child of the Sun Returning, and all of that. And so now, what the Laurel government does is it translates all of that into Tagalog. And the last part of it, Nang Mamatay Nang Dahil Sa'yo, is our today. At that time, they said, no, ang aming bangkay ang hahadlang. So it is our bodies are going to block the invader and so forth. So stronger Filipino identity. And apart from the national anthem, which is now coming out in Tagalog or Filipino, there was a march. We had the march for General Huachi. There was a march for President Laurel. This is actually the second of two that came out at the time. And aside from this, you also had Marcha ng Bagong Pilipinas. Marcha ng Bagong Pilipinas was the winner of a nationwide contest for a patriotic tune, and it was composed by Lucio San Pedro, national artist. Now, Lucio San Pedro composed this very, very patriotic march. Can catch it to see how catchy it is. It's something that's supposed to make you want to march. Okay, so there was also music for ordinary life. Now let's be proud of our own tradition. There was a piece for farmers. There was a piece for fishermen. This was for Lupang Tinubuan, native land, and even the Kundiman ng Bayan. So this shows a very different shift from the earlier Japanese occupation. This is now a more pro-Filipino profile that was coming out, despite the fact that the Japanese censors were still there. But Laurel pushed to have a more Filipino outlook. And it's one thing that we usually overlook in our histories today. The Japanese occupation was not just one period under the Japanese. There were different sub-periods within it. During the Japanese occupation as well, in order to try to emphasize the Filipino-ness of the Philippines. Remember, the Manila Symphony Orchestra was not allowed to play. Zipper said, no, we're not going to collaborate, we'll hide the instruments. So the Japanese said, all right, we'll create our own orchestra using Filipino musicians entirely. And if the European conductor, Zipper, didn't want to conduct, we'll find some Filipino to conduct it instead. And Felipe Padilla de Leon did conduct it for a while, and San Pedro conducted it also. And when the all-Filipino orchestra came out, it was called, guess what? The New Philippines Symphony Orchestra. So it made its debut in 1942, and all Philippine artists, conductor, musicians, and by November, they were able to host a program of all Filipino music. No Western music, everything was composed by Filipinos. So these are the covers of the programs. The one on the left is the second performance of this all Filipino symphony orchestra. And then you have on the right side, you have the first performance of an all Philippine repertoire. No Western music here, it was all Filipino. So these were changes that were interesting. And again, jazz, no, there's no jazz here again, because the jazz, that's bawal. You're not supposed to do that kind of thing. This thing is still all right. You're bringing in nationalism and so forth. The Japanese also wanted to show that the Japanese were very musical as well, that the Japanese had their own musical tradition. So, this is the New Philippines Symphony Orchestra in its first performance, again in the Metropolitan Theater. So again, the Metropolitan Theater is very important at this time for the official functions. Now the Japanese cultural missions would come. In 1942, there would be a dance group, song and dance group called the Shochiku Dance Troupe. It actually still exists today. And it came in 1942 more to raise the morale of the Japanese soldiers. So it also performed in the Metropolitan Theater. And then it toured the hospitals where Japanese wounded soldiers were. But the Japanese said, well, that's more for the Japanese soldiers. They did perform traditional Japanese music. They brought in traditional Japanese costumes and so forth. But they also brought in their own version of the French can-can, the leggy stage shows. 1943, the Japanese said, let's be more serious about this. We'll bring in a real, professional, a very, very artistically acclaimed team of Japanese musicians. And so in order to time it with Philippine independence in 1943, the Japanese sent a musical mission in October of 1943, headed by the important Japanese composer Kosaki Yamada. Now, Kosaki Yamada had studied in Europe. He had mixed Western music ideas with Japanese music and was one of the more progressive Japanese composers of that time. So he was very well acclaimed. He was internationally known, and he came to the Philippines with a pianist, a sopranist, a xylophonist, and they all performed at the Metropolitan Theater as well. And Yamada was so impressed by the Philippines that he would come back again in November. He came in October for the independence ceremonies. He came back in November to give another series of concerts and talk to Philippine musical aficionados to tell them what Japanese music was like. And he struck a very good chord with the Filipino musicians and Philippine musical writers, and he left a strong impression. This was not the military, this was art, this was culture, so it worked pretty well. This is the Shochiku Dance Troupe in the Metropolitan Theater. So even though you have jazz band, this was what the Japanese were entertaining their soldiers with. This is Kosaki Yamada, again the well-known composer of that time. And when he came, this is the program for the October 1943 commemorative concert for Philippine independence. When he came back in November, he was so impressed that he would compose a symphony, or actually this is an awit, this is a song, but he would also try to compose a whole symphony for the Philippines. He was so impressed by what he saw here, and he did compose this. Unfortunately, none of this is recorded. Although since we have the music, we can probably ask some group to perform it, and we can probably record it at some future time. So, insofar as the formal musical and theatrical scene was concerned, this was very vibrant. It was very, very alive. And there was also film music that came about. So again, the American movies were gradually pushed out, and they were replaced by Japanese movies. Most of the Japanese movies were propagandistic, military, success in Hong Kong, success in Singapore, and so on and so forth, fighting in China and so forth. But some of them did have very catchy tunes. So one of them that had very catchy tune was something called Evenings in China, or Shina no Yoru. Shina no Yoru, however, was something that was a little more emotional. It was a little romantic, and the Japanese censors didn't particularly like it, because it had Western overtones. It was romance, it was Hollywood type of thing. So they kind of suppressed it. And yet people of that generation did remember, yes, we remember Shina no Yoru, or Evenings in China. Now, insofar as the only real Filipino movie that was made during the war that had music with it, this was a movie called Tatlong Maria, or the Three Marias. Very propagandistic in its own way also, because it talked about city life as not being for Filipinos. City life was Western, it was American, it was alien to Filipinos. Filipinos should go back to the barrios, they should go back to their hometowns and go rediscover their roots. So it was a movie, at least Tatlong Maria, came out very late in the war, but it involved very important female artists. And it did have a number of songs, which unfortunately came out too late in the war to really be played in public. This is the brochure for Tatlong Maria, to invite people to come and watch it. Again, the first showing was in the Metropolitan Theater, all star-studded cast and everything, and all the people invited, very top-level members of government and from the Japanese administration. But these are two of the music, these are two of the songs that came out from the movie. And they actually had time to actually publish the sheet music like this. Unfortunately, they were never really played in public, because this was already November of 1944, and the air raids were coming already. MacArthur had landed in Leyte and so forth. So, while we've looked into the kind of more formal side of music during the occupation, we know that you cannot stop the popular music. It's like saying, or at least in the older days, you can't listen to BTS. You can't, in the much older days in the 60s, you can't listen to Beatles. You can't do that. It's something that you simply cannot do. So in the Philippines, people had to be entertained. And if there were no movies coming out, then somehow you had to provide entertainment for them. So what came out was a new phenomenon called the stage show. The stage show was kind of a combination of the 1920s vaudeville and also a little of the zarzuela tradition earlier on, plus a little bit of Hollywood and simply very corny Filipino humor. The kind of thing I think that you'd probably see in Showtime today, on TV nowadays. So the stage show was a mixture of musical, slapstick comedy, magic, skits, vaudeville, leggy shows, and so forth. Each of the theaters, remember in Rizal Avenue we saw the big theaters, there were even more, there were smaller theaters. Each theater had its own director, its cast, and of course its musicians. And since that was just about the only entertainment available, not only in Manila, but in other cities, Cebu, Angeles, Baguio, and so forth, these shows were extremely popular, standing room only. In fact, one of the theaters in Manila in 1944 would report that its balcony would collapse because it was overcrowded with the audience. So they had to do something. You have to stop this. And the stage shows were live. They were performed live. There was no TV yet at that time. So the artists had to memorize their lines and perform them. And so each show was different because there would be adjustments on each presentation. And they had strong rapport with the audience. So they made the audience laugh. They made the audience cry. They stunned the audience with the brilliance of their sets and so forth. It was a very unique period of time where you have the actors and the musicians meeting with the audience and trying to come up with what the audience wanted and what the director and the artist wanted also. So you have a meeting of minds there. It was a fantastic period of time, so much so that some of the directors and artists of that time would say that was the golden age of Philippine theater, because there was no movie. The movies were no challenge to this at all. People had to go to the theaters. Now, there was also censorship. The Japanese, of course, wanted to watch, make sure that this kowtows to the main line of the propaganda. You're not going to have anything pro-American and so forth. You're not going to have the so-called seditious playwrights here. Now, we can actually be seditious in our own way. And for example, one Japanese writer wrote a whole script, and it was called Bukang Liwayway. It was supposed to be set in early World War II. A Japanese soldier fighting Filipino soldier. And in the end, the two of them meet and they agree to be friends. That's now the future of the Philippines. The Bukang Liwayway, the dawn, Japan, the Philippines will be friends. Now, what happened there? This was a Japanese written script, and so you have, at one point, the Japanese soldier coming on stage, and you have the Filipino leading artist coming on stage. They meet together, they shake their hands, and the audience response, they did not clap when the Japanese came on stage. And when the Filipino leading actor, who was a Bataan veteran, came on stage, audience standing ovation. And the Japanese says, we want to be friends, we'll cast away the American tradition and so forth. And nobody clapped. Then when the Filipinos said, we're going to stand our ground, we are nationalistic, we'll fight for the flag, standing ovation again. And the Japanese censor said, there's something wrong. This is not supposed to be the reaction of the audience. So they called the director to Fort Santiago. Why? Why is this? It's because the actor playing the Filipino side is a very popular actor. He was Leopoldo Salcedo. So he was very well known. So he's very important. He's a movie star. So that's why they stand. That's why they clap for him. So the Japanese said, okay, replace him. Put another guy. When another guy who was not so well known came on stage, again, applause, and everybody stood up. What's wrong? This guy is not known. And so the Japanese said, something's wrong. We'll pull this out. No way. We'll not continue it anymore. So somehow, things like that, when it's too forced, it doesn't work. And then you'd have also this very daring comedy team, the duo, Pugo and Tugo. Now, the Japanese felt that the name was not good. Tugo in particular. It sounds too much like Japanese Admiral Togo. Japanese Admiral Togo was a hero of the Russo-Japanese War. He was a folk hero of Japan. The name Tugo is a disgrace to Admiral Togo. Change the name. So they became, after that, Puging and Tuging. But anyway, the two of them had a very humorous bent. They were still alive after the war, and they were really a fantastic comedy duo. And at one point, I think it was Tugo asks his companion, what time is it? Anong oras na ba? And the other one, his companion, lifts his sleeve and exposed 5 or 6 watches there. And the audience laughed. Total. This is the typical Japanese soldier who has all the watches on his sleeve. So the Japanese soldiers didn't have watches, or they couldn't afford them, and all of a sudden here they could get many watches, and so many of them were seen with several watches on their sleeve. So because of that joke, Pugo and Tugo were called to Fort Santiago. Said, why are you making fun of the Japanese soldiers? Don't do this again. They had many more jokes, but we don't have time for that anyway. So anyway, if you go into the songs they were singing and so forth, they all had their innuendos and they all had hidden meanings. And this is what Rizal Avenue looked like during the war. Now notice it's the same Rizal Avenue, but one thing is missing: traffic. There are no cars anymore, because at this time, people could no longer drive cars. Gasoline was rationed, and the cars were taken over by Japanese or the government. So the theaters are still there, people are there, but the cars are gone. Now, I don't think we'll see Rizal Avenue in this format now. We won't see it like this. But anyway, the stage show. So these are two ads of stage shows in different parts of Manila. So we see song and dance number, you have magic, you have skits and so forth. The one on the right side clearly says vaudeville. So it's bringing back the vaudeville tradition. The one on the right side is, I think, in Santa Cruz. It's a small town theater. This other one here is Strand Theater. It's one of the larger theaters in downtown Manila. But the one thing about this, again, was periodically you would have Japanese coming into the audience to watch what was going on and check whether the script was proper or not. Oh, here's another interesting ad, because this was an advertisement that was put into the program of the New Philippine Symphony Orchestra. So in the New Philippine Symphony Orchestra, you're trying to talk about classical music, Philippine participation in the formal musical sense, and yet look what it says here. After the concert, or is it this one? Yeah. After the concert, you go to the floor show, enjoy dinner and dance. So that's precisely what the Japanese didn't want. This is American style stuff. And yet this was in the this was in the program of the New Philippine Symphony Orchestra. Here, this is more clear. This one is the one. No? So after the concert, go to this bar and enjoy yourself. Let your hair down, kind of thing. And again, this is in the same program for the New Philippine Symphony Orchestra. So you have the two trends, the more formal classical sense, and you have the informal or very popular sense. Two other advertisements. These are now interesting because these are not from Manila anymore, but these are from Bulacan. They are from Malolos. So they also show that the whole tradition of the stage show was also continuing, and you have the mixture of music and dance and skits in these musical and in these programs. This is Pugo and Tugo. So at the height of their popularity, Pugo and Tugo with their bald heads, these were the classic comedians of the time. This is a caricature of what Philippine stage was like during the war. The artist who did this was Nonoy Marcelo. If you're familiar with Tisoy or Ikabod Buwit, this was the guy who penned those. This was 25 years after the war, and so he captured the essence of Pugo and Tugo. You see Pugo and Tugo there, and you see Cati de la Cruz. Remember Cati de la Cruz we mentioned earlier, and you see a Japanese soldier behind with watches on his sleeve. So it captures the whole spirit of what Filipinos perceived at that time. The vaudeville was something that even the controlled publications could not ignore. This is a pictorial that came out in the pictorial magazine Shinseki, Behind the Scenes in Vaudeville. This is Lamberto Avellana, national artist. He told me many stories of what life was like in the Avenue Theater, what Pugo and Tugo were doing. And among other stories he told me was that when Japanese were in the audience and there were guerrillas in the audience, you would have a singer come on stage. Unannounced, he would come out. Everyone knew who he was by name, by reputation, not so much his name, but then he would sing a song that would tell the guerrillas, there are Japanese in the audience, make your way out. Okay, well, before we go into that song again, the theater world was so developed actually that they actually had a weekly newspaper that was called Backstage. And it talked about, Metropolitan Theater is air-conditioned already, among other things. And then the front page is in English, the last pages are in Tagalog. So it hit the people from different walks of life. And it announced what was showing in the Metropolitan Theater, what was showing in Avenue Theater, and the other theaters. But again, there was that singer who would appear in the Avenue Theater in particular. He was known before the war simply as the mystery singer. Nobody really knew his name. After the war, it was known that his real name was Cecil Lloyd. He was an American mestizo, actually, and his voice was very brilliant. So he didn't have to be known insofar as his real name, but the mystery singer, when you heard his voice, you would melt. It was such a sentimental voice. And the song that he would sing when Japanese were in the audience and when the guerrillas were in the audience, the song that he would sing was Bakit Hindi Ka Dumarating? Bakit Ka Hindi Dumarating? Okay, it's much longer than that, but again, I can only put in a snatch. So anyway, this is an interesting recording. It was done 40 years after the war in 1982, but this was still the mystery singer singing it in the Manila Hotel for a group of veterans in a memorial concert. So after the war, he established his own record label, which is called Bataan, as we see here, very rare thing to get now. But after the war, he continued to be a very famous singer. And he would go to Japan after the war and also sing in Japanese clubs. Now, apart from all of this stuff, we're talking about the Japanese occupation itself. Now, there was also music in the underground. So the Japanese in Manila, in Baguio, in Cebu, they all had their controls, and musicians, composers operated under those considerations. But in the so-called free areas, those areas controlled by the guerrillas, you had musicians, you had composers who would also compose for Filipino resistance fighters, for guerrillas, and they motivated them. So, in fact, what is the one, this particular, okay, so some of them appropriated American tunes. Beer Barrel Polka, if you're familiar with that. That was used by San Miguel Beer a few years ago as part of their advertising music. This was a popular pre-war thing, Beer Barrel Polka. Now the hunters guerrillas appropriated that and it became Aid Barrel Polka, waiting for the American aid to come. This other one here is God Bless the Philippines, a very celebrated American Hollywood musical writer by the name of Irving Berlin. Before the war had composed a very catchy theme called God Bless America. That was sung in the Philippines before the war, when the war started. And during the war, the guerrillas appropriated it and changed it to God Bless the Philippines. So we'll see that there's a longer story to that. But anyway, we appropriated some of this. There were others who composed on their own. The Hooks, for example, composed their own songs without music. And Ramon Manglapus, again, composed for the guerrillas. And another composer on the classical side, Ramon Tapales, would be in the mountains of Negros, and he would compose a tune for the guerrillas there. It would be called Ave Liberatur. And I think that's the composition that we have here. And even Julio Nactil, who had composed music in the 1890s and had composed what would have been our national anthem had Bonifacio won in the revolution, the Marangal na Dalit ng mga anyway, I forgot. Anyway, he did compose in the 1890s. That would have been our national anthem had Bonifacio survived. Anyway, things had changed. Anyway, Julio Nactil was still alive in 1944, and even he composed a victory march to impress upon the people that the Americans were coming back. So let's play this first one. Imagine that you're in the mountains of Negros Occidental and you're playing this out of Japanese station. This is from the national anthem. Okay, anyway, that's the main part of it. Even music was used in the propaganda that MacArthur was issuing. And remember the march that we had started this program with, Mabuhay, the Mabuhay March? That was appropriated also and was published in this issue of Free Philippines, which was smuggled into the Philippines by submarine. So that's the same Mabuhay that we heard earlier on, that we now hear as the presidential march today. Other guerrillas composed their own compositions. This was in the mountains of Rizal. It was published in this underground newspaper. And the same newspaper also published this. So they had their writers, they had their songwriters in the mountains. This is Julio Nakpil's composition, which interestingly enough was dedicated to, I'm not sure if you can read the top, this is his handwriting. His handwriting here is dedicated to the armies of the United States and the Philippines and our guerrillas. So he covered everything. So he was living in Manila at that time. It was probably his last formal composition, and he came out of retirement to write this. And that is okay, anyway, you see the difference in style. He had been brought up in the 1880s and 1890s. So if you're familiar with earlier works, you'd see that there's a continuity in his writing style. Well, people in the States were also composing music for the Philippines. The one on the left was written by an American to celebrate the Filipino and American heroes in Bataan. It's something that was published and was actually performed in the States. On the right side, the Men of MacArthur, that was composed by a Filipino composer in the United States, Rodolfo Cornejo, who would come here later when the war ended. Now, the Liberation era. So we'll come to the end of our talk for this afternoon. The Liberation era, as we know, brought the destruction of many of the theaters. So many of them were not rebuilt after the war, but with the return of the Americans came back American popular music. And big band jazz, once again, came out in the open. Now that American soldiers were here, American soldiers wanted to hear something more familiar. And the Philippine audience wanted to hear also things that they had not heard since the start of the war. So American hits came back very, very quickly to an audience that was starved of those. So radio brought in American music, American jazz. Records came in, they were called V-discs. They were records that had the name V-disc on it that the soldiers brought with them. And together with them came what were called the hit kits. These were music books. Remember that Japanese brought their music books. The American soldiers brought their own music books as well, the hit kits and their own music books. Now we mentioned earlier that Irving Berlin had composed God Bless America, which was popular in the Philippines before the war. The guerrillas had borrowed this and changed it to God Bless the Philippines. And Irving Berlin visited the Philippines in 1945. And he was kind of surprised to hear Filipinos welcoming him and singing God Bless the Philippines, but they were singing God Bless the Philippines instead. And part of it said, on the mountains and on the prairies. Now, we don't have prairies here, so they changed it to on the mountains and on the hills and the plains. So it was Philippinized again. But anyway, Irving Berlin felt, no, that's for the United States, that's for the Americans. I will compose something for you instead. And so he composed something called Heaven Watch the Philippines, which for quite some time was sung in the Philippine schools long after the war. Now, also coming with the Liberation era came Hollywood movies again, and together with the Hollywood movies came a revival of Philippine movies. And with the Philippine movies came a revival of Philippine film music. That had not been there in World War II because there were very few films that came out anyway. So you have a revival of sorts, and musicians adapting very quickly to this changed situation would play tunes that they were familiar with before the war. Again, they learned the latest hits and played them for the American soldiers. And this is what Rizal Avenue looked like after the war. See, most of it had been burned. The Avenue Theater, which is where Avellana directed, that was a shell of itself at that time. It was no longer functioning. The Metropolitan Theater was all burned out also. So you really could not use any of the old pre-war theaters. So you had to resort to theaters outside. You had to go to Ongpin, you had to go to other areas of Manila that still had surviving theaters. This is the V-disc. It's a larger disc than that, of course, but that's why it was called the V-disc. This was the record. On the right side, we can see how even the American soldiers brought music with them. They brought with them portable record players that you wound up with a crank, and you could play the V-disc there, and therefore you could play the boogie-woogie and everything you wanted. And so that brought to a close, in a sense, what we experienced during the Japanese occupation. The hit kit looked like this. It was one of many issues that came out during that time. And stage shows would continue on for a while before the regular theaters were built. What's interesting here is that you see movies and phrases that had been now accommodated or borrowed by Philippine film stars. I shall return. And notice the other one there, hanggang Pierre ka lang, or hanggang Pierre. That was the saying there because many Filipinos wanted to become boyfriends of American soldiers, and they were warned, hanggang Pierre ka lang, because once the American soldier leaves, you're not going with him. And so you will only be until the pier. So there were musicals out of that, new movies came out of that, and heroism as well would be brought out now that we could tell it again. But look, you still have vaudeville. Vaudeville is still there. And Irving Berlin did come to Manila. That's him on the right side here. On the left side is Herbert Zipper, who is now able to come out with the Manila Symphony Orchestra and play in public. And the Filipino composer in the center is none other than Francisco Santiago, a celebrated Filipino composer who was one of our most prominent composers before and after the war. Here is Irving Berlin trying to teach a Filipino choir how to sing his new song, Heaven Watch the Philippines. And that's the sheet music, the cover of the sheet music, Heaven Watch the Philippines. It was something that was commercial, of course, but he dedicated that to the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of the Philippines. So any public performance that made money, the money went to the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts of the Philippines. And so this was one of those performances right after the war. The big theaters were no longer usable. This was a small theater in Ongpin, Rex Theater. This is the Manila Symphony Orchestra in full force, under the being conducted by Herbert Zipper. Filipino composers, of course, continued to compose in their traditions. Liberation, movie music on the right side, which is from a movie called Victory Joe. But again, the reality was, while you have formal music, you also have popular music. And this was what was going on in the bars and the cabarets all over Manila. Sailors, soldiers, and notice the band on the right, a jazz band. So we end our talk with this book that we'd seen earlier. This is the 1949 edition, and among the music that it contained here was a lot of pre-war Philippine nationalistic music, and incidentally, Heaven Watch the Philippines as well. So with that, maraming salamat. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Doc Rico, for such a comprehensive look at least 20s to 50s, those decades spanning the entertainment scene of that time. May I ask you to stay upstage for a short presentation? And may I invite Ms. Mariles Gostillo, the Senior Director of the Arts and Culture Division of Ayala Foundation, to join you for the certificate presentation. Yes. And now, before we begin the much anticipated Q&A session, before we open the floor for discussion, let me just give a few reminders. For our on-site guest, if you have a question, please raise your hand and a member of our staff will bring you a microphone. For Zoom attendees, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. We give priority to that box over questions typed in the chat box. And for Facebook viewers, please use the comment section of the Facebook live stream. We are a little pressed for time. Doc Rico, would you mind extending a little to accommodate a few more questions? And for the audience, would that also be okay? Because we only really have 15 minutes left, and the Q&A session of our talks is really the richest part of the talk, which is the audience interaction. So with that, are there any questions from the audience? I actually have a number of questions from Zoom. I see somebody at the back raising their hand with the green mask.
Hello, sir. So first of all, congrats to your talk. Actually, this is a little bit inspirational and at the same time mind-blowing. So I'd just like to ask po, in regards po, if for example, kasi I just noticed that after the war period, like, during the theatrical period, so how does that has an impact po on the development of the post-war theater, especially on the modern and contemporary Philippine theater due to the war effects po? So there, thank you.
Yeah, some people would say that, of course, the war was, the occupation was the golden age for Philippine theater. It was not replicated. Even after the war, it was overcome by movies, and when TV came in the 1950s, that was it. So live theater really took a step backwards at the time. But I think people were inspired and people were affected. The comic aspects of that era would continue on long after the war. And insofar as composition was concerned, actually some Filipino composers could see that there was merit in the Japanese composers and artists who came in here. There was a continuing connection between the Japanese and some Filipinos even after the war. So, for example, Lucrecia Casilag took the Japanese occupation very seriously. She learned the Japanese music, and later on she would be inspired by what she had learned during the war to dig more deeply into Philippine musical tradition. And she would look not only into the Philippine musical tradition, but Asian and Japanese musical tradition too. So for the more intellectual of the Filipinos, I think they saw there was some benefit they could get out of this. For others, however, it was really, well, whatever was more popular at that time, that was what they catered to. If the GI sense of humor was popular, then that's what they lived up to. Again, your rapport with the audience was very, very important. You gave them what they needed, or you tried to give them what you thought they needed.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, the woman with the peach or pink shirt in the back row.
Actually, I wanted Sarah to be my last question because some of the songs were parang naabutan ko yata. I would just like to know kasi at that time, nauso yung cassette, long playing album, and then whatever. So now, I wanted to ask you, where can I hear that again? Or can I play it again, di ba?
Yeah. Okay, there is a revival actually of vinyl record players. So some of my high school classmates are looking for LPs and they're buying record players. You can actually, there are shops, I think in Ali Mall, for example, they have specialty shops that sell vinyl records and record players. There are collectors of this actually. But if you search online, there's actually quite a repertoire of stuff online. In fact, the Hoover Institution for War and Peace Studies has a whole collection of World War II radio recordings. And they have several that emanated from the Philippines. And the National Archives of the US also has one. Even if you're familiar with archive.org, archive.org, or they actually have a whole series. If you look at it, war news from 1941, 42, 43, every year gives you a whole bunch of not only war news, but the popular records of that time. So if you want, in fact, they have many of these V-discs already online. If you want to listen to Glenn Miller, if you want to listen to Tommy Dorsey, this is archive.org, archive.org. Look under the radio news World War II, and then choose your year, and it has a whole series of V-discs. And if you want, I was tempted to listen to them, in fact, but I didn't have enough time. But you can download these for free. So, of course, they sound like 78 RPM records, but that's what they sounded like at the time.
Yes, Richie, very, very pleased to hear from our speaker from last year, Richie Quirino. Please stand up. There we go.
How are you related to our great orchestral conductor, Ricardo Jose?
Regalado Jose is my father.
Well, that explains everything. Very nice, thank you.
So he was, I think he was about 13 years old during the war. He narrated his experiences during the war, but he was very humble. He didn't say everything. It's his colleagues who said he was discovered during the war in a piano competition. And a lot of the music students fell in, well, they had crushes on him. But he was too serious with his piano. But he was my father. So actually, I mentioned to you that some of these recordings have a very close emotional connection with me. The ones that were not very loud actually were performances that my father conducted with the Metropolitan Manila Symphony Orchestra way back in 1981-82. And the Mabuhay March was also performed by the Metro Manila Symphony Orchestra, conducted by my father.
And to the wife. One of our Jeepney Jazz creative partners, Tonette.
Doctor said, what I get from your talk is that jazz was really more of a self-expression type of music, right? So during the Japanese time, even when people were playing, on the side,
Yes.
outside the Japanese censorship,
Yes.
but there was no, I didn't get the understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, that they were actually like nationalistic undertones in those performances. It's really just for entertainment. Is that a correct impression?
Yeah, I think for the jazz artists at that time, I think it was really more of entertainment because most of them were actually performing in second-class bars and cabarets and stuff like that. Some of the more skilled were performing with the orchestras and the more formal institutions. But yeah, for example, Angel Peña, who was a cellist, or rather a bass player, he found it very difficult to perform. He had to go from one band to another because while the more formal people had regular jobs, those who were really moonlighting or those who were doing it part-time, it was quite difficult for them.
Yes, there are other Jeepney Jazz.
Hi, Dr. Jose. It was a fantastic lecture. Thank you very much. My question relates to Borromeo Lu. And, you know, Peter Kepi's book on Borromeo Lu and the Indonesians.
Yes.
You know, you didn't touch so much on the era pre-World War, but the little bit I know is that, of course, there was quite a bit of exportation of jazz by Filipinos to not only through Borromeo Lu, but others around Southeast Asia.
Yes. Yes.
And I was wondering if you could just comment on that and how that process worked and the type of respect that Filipino jazz entertainers and musicians had.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of one aspect. And then exactly, you know, there was also a place called Little Tokyo, I believe, prior to World War II.
Yes.
So there was interface with the Japanese who had settled here. There were quite a robust group of Japanese.
Yes.
Did jazz also permeate amongst those quarters? And you know, that was a very congenial time.
Right. Right.
And was there any legacy that was left and carried over once the war ended? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, two very important questions. Let me try to answer them as briefly as I can. The first one, I think Filipinos were we still are very artistically talented. And so I think we were better off than most other Southeast Asians in performing jazz. And that's why we were going to Singapore, we were going to Jakarta. And while, yes, Peter Kepi mentions there were some there were jazz aficionados and pioneers in Indonesia as well, I think we had an edge over them. Because again, we listen to a tune, we can pick it up right away and play it very quickly. I think that's a talent that we have among Filipinos. So that was one thing that made Filipinos very popular, not only in Japan, but I think Hong Kong, China, Southeast Asia. I think that gave us an edge. It still gives us an edge today. If you go around Southeast Asia, we still are very important. We play important roles there. The second question is an interesting one because what was the mixture or what was the how did the Japanese in the pre-war years mix with Filipino years? I don't think they had jazz in their areas. They were quite segregated. There was in Pasig there was this place called Little Tokyo, but the larger Japanese presence in the Philippines was in Davao. You had easily 20, 30,000 Japanese in Davao. And I don't think they had jazz. They were more conservative. They brought in their musicians. They brought in wives from Japan even. So what was the legacy of these Japanese before the war? The legacy is, in a physical sense, we can still see part of their legacy because many of them were carpenters. And they built houses in Baguio. They built houses in Davao. And you can see, even in Iloilo, you can see houses with the Japanese architectural frame there. These were the Japanese architects brought in with them these Japanese styles with them. So that's one impact, I suppose. The other one was there were a number of mixed marriages at that time, but after the war, all the Japanese had to go home. They were all deported, and that meant that the mixed marriages were broken up. So the children who were children of Japanese fathers, many years after the war had to tell others that my father is Chinese or something else. They had to hide that. until the 1980s, when Japan became a major economic player, and Japan began to express its interest in looking for descendants in other parts of the world. And therefore, that opened the door for these Nisei or Sansei, the Japanese descendants here, to begin looking for their Japanese parents or relatives in Japan. That process continues on to this day.
Thank you. I don't want to neglect our online audience, so let me just ask one question from there. This is from Bing Castro, and she writes, "My deceased parents lived in this time. They lived a simple life. It never crossed my mind that there was an art and culture scene during the Japanese occupation. Who would put up such, and who would spend to see one?"
Okay. Interesting question. Most Filipinos who lived through that era would remember the hardship, the hunger, the difficulties, and so forth. But in so doing, they forgot that they also had fun. So in 1967, when the Sunday Times Magazine put out that special on World War II, they had that special article, "The Fun Beneath the Fear." So they said, in spite of the fear, we managed to make fun. And I guess when we remember things that happened in the past, it's easier to remember the more traumatic things, and we forget the daily things. Who were going to watch these plays in the theater? Most of them are nameless to this day. I have not found. I think I met a few who watched. It was very cheap at that time. In fact, they had 3 showings: one in the morning, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. So you went whenever you wanted to, and you waited for your star, and you waited if you could watch it again. Some of them did come back again to watch the play again, because they were never ever the same again. They had the subtle differences, and so I think it's the one thing I guess we took it all for granted that we had a daily life, but hindi interesanto. It's not interesting to remember the daily life. What's more interesting are the air raids and the fighting and so forth. So you have to pry that out, actually. In fact, it's surprising that it was so vibrant in some of the cities, that there was really a vibrant cultural scene that was going on at that time.
Yes, that's definitely true, because when we think of the war, we most think of rationing, of scarcity.
Yes.
So even the idea of, if you need money for food, why would you spend it for entertainment, right? It's very fascinating.
Yes.
Sticking with our online audience, this question is from Facebook. Anonymous says, "Can you please enlighten us about the propaganda movie which starred Fernando Poe Sr. and Leopoldo Salcedo?" Thank you.
Okay, there were 3 full-length movies made during the war. The first was Victory Song Over the Orient, which was more of a documentary thing. It was not a staged thing. These were documentary footages shot in Bataan and so forth. So that was the first one that came out. It was 2 hours. The second one was a full-length movie that was acted out by not just Filipino artists and Filipino directors, but also with a key Japanese director who came here to direct the Japanese scenes. And Japanese actors came here. So it was, in a sense, our first Filipino-Japanese cooperative movie venture. It was basically a propaganda thing where you had Japan fighting Filipinos, and in the end, the Filipinos being won over to the Japanese side and said, "You are correct." And yes, Fernando Poe Sr., who had actually fought in Bataan, was given the title role, and it's he who eventually went to the Japanese side in the end. Except that there was, what would you call it? It was a hidden meaning behind this. One of the last scenes shows Fernando Poe talking to his Japanese counterpart, and the Japanese counterpart is, "We are friends, Japan and the Philippines won." And Fernando Poe says, "No matter how you say it, I cannot understand what you're saying." And finally the Japanese would say, "Tomodachi," friend, me, kaibigan. And they shake hands on that and they bow. Throughout that scene, there is a hidden message there that shows Fernando Poe Sr. towering over the Japanese. So the Japanese is small, and you have Fernando Poe having the control of that whole scene, actually. And in that sense, when Filipinos watched the movie, they could see some of the innuendos. They could see this is not what we really heard about Bataan. So we know that this was a propaganda movie. It did have some of its very good technical points. We were introduced to that. Was the Filipino director, became national artist, and the Japanese director was also very famous at that time. So it was a very, insofar as Philippine movie in the history, it was a landmark. Regardless of the fact that it was wartime, it was propaganda, it was something that we learned from, actually.
Thank you. I feel like we can ask Doc Rico about anything, and we will even get film textual analysis from the question. We are at the 4 p.m. mark, but we will do a 15-minute extension if the audience is okay with that, so we can accommodate more questions. I still have questions on Zoom, but I would like to return to our on-site audience if anybody has questions here. Of course, many people have questions. The first person who raised their hand was the lady in white with the glasses, and then this gentleman here.
Good afternoon po. So, I'm actually a teacher of contemporary Filipino art. So, my question is, during my teachings in musical arts in the Philippines, in contemporary musical arts, we start in post World War II music. So, is it okay, or in your opinion, do we need to start, or is it much better to start the teaching of contemporary music arts during the World War II era, or the post-America era?
Yeah, I think the main point is to define what contemporary is. Contemporary usually means post-war or fairly recent. No? So, but if you include, I would think to get the proper perspective, you cannot start with the end of the war. You have to go earlier on, because there are strands, there are traditions that are there already by the post-war era. And so the post-war era has to build up on these existing strands. So I don't think you can start with, let's say, 1946 per se. You have to look what happened before. So why was Antonino Buenaventura, for example, already conscious? Why was Felipe Padilla de Leon? And then he would later on compose for the Bagong Lipunan and all of that. So what was in the minds of these people? These were shaped long before the war. So you have to put it in context. So you can start with 1946, but you have to have a long introductory period that will say this already existed, and this was what was there when this so-called contemporary period began.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is, since you have mentioned to us that Herbert Zipper's resistance made him decide for Manila Symphony Orchestra to be uninvolved with state performances under the new colonial power, was the creation of the Philippine National Theater Incorporated and Dramatic Philippines, which managed Metropolitan Theater during the Japanese occupation, was also formed in that similar reason of resistance to the earlier Metropolitan Theater Company headed by Horace Fund and Filipino and multinational businessmen and politicians of the pre-war period.
Yes, I think that's very much in line with that. Now, if you look at what's going on in theater, I didn't focus too much on the Philippine Artistic League or the PAL and other groups that came out at that time. What's interesting in the wartime league, with the wartime artist groups, is they're now Filipino. Now, before the war, they were mixed. They had Americans or they had others. But I think that was what the Japanese wanted to highlight. And in a sense, it gave impetus to this Filipinization of the arts. So, yeah, well, even the Philippine Artistic League was suspected by the Japanese. They said, you're waiting for the Americans and so forth. They were arrested. But they said, no, we're Filipino. And yes, I think that was a similar reaction to, let's say, the MSO not performing. The Japanese created their own. And maybe to some extent, the Japanese didn't have to create it because the local groups would have created it themselves.
Thank you very much, sir.
There was a third hand raised, but I didn't catch the person.
Hi, Professor. Good afternoon. It was very inspiring, the talk. I just like to know regarding the Negros you mentioned,
Yes.
because I'm from there, and we have ruins. I don't know if you're
Yes,
familiar.
yes, yes,
So
yes.
is that correlated to, to the
Yes.
music or arts?
No, I don't. The ruins, the restaurant.
No. Well, actually, it's an old house,
Ah,
and
okay.
now it's like a museum by the Gastons.
Ah, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
but you can
yes.
use it for a wedding,
Yes,
baptism,
yes,
or
yes.
so on.
I'm not sure if that had any connection with the arts actually, but when the Japanese
The
came in,
Japanese, yeah.
when the Japanese came into Negros Occidental, Bacolod, and so forth, some of the guerrillas actually burned some of the houses to prevent the Japanese from using them. So in some cases, some of those ruins have been maintained to show this is the disaster of war. This should not happen again. So I'm not sure. I don't know enough about all the ruins in the Bacolod area, Negros Occidental. But I do know some of them were done by the guerrillas. Others were caused by American bombings after the war or at the end of the war. Others were caused by the Japanese. So this kind of thing has to be, it's hard to generalize, and you have to really go into more specific actions at that time.
Because my mom was then 2 years old. She was given chocolates by the American
Yes,
soldiers,
yes, yes.
while the bayonets are
Right.
doing all this stuff, the Japanese.
Yes,
So
yes.
thank you so
Yes,
much.
yes.
I would like to say something about when the Japanese were trying to reel us back to becoming Asians.
Yeah.
I think their tagline was Asia
Yes,
Co-Prosperity
co-prosperity
Sphere.
Yes.
So that's a tagline. Now my question is regarding Katie de la Cruz or Cathy de la Cruz. Most of the information that I have was based from watching the
play.
musical
Yeah, the
Katie.
musical,
So there, she was discovered by the Americans and sent to the States to sing jazz.
Yeah.
So Filipino jazz, and she
Yeah.
was presented as Katie from Shanghai, and then she said, "No, I'm from Manila."
Yeah.
And now she was still very prolific during the Japanese occupation with
Yes.
Mary Walter.
Yes.
So my question is, I could not imagine Katie de la Cruz not singing jazz. So what she'd been singing during the Japanese occupation?
I would suppose that she sang a bit of jazz. It was their own form of resistance, actually.
Because I could not imagine her
yeah.
singing kundiman or...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, her training, her character was very different. In fact, the advertisement that we saw, I think she was singing jazz. While the Japanese while they frowned on that, I think they could not really completely block it out. It still had to be played. And yeah, people like Katie de la Cruz and Mary Walter and Chichay, all of those would continue what they were doing before the war. You cannot shift 180 degrees and move into a genre that you're not familiar with. And the people recognize you for that.
And another thing that I want to share is a lot of people are familiar with Payapang Daigdig.
Yes.
It's a Christmas song. It's one of the songs composed during the Japanese occupation, or I think the ending of the war, with the destruction in Manila.
I think the story is that it was composed in 1945 when the war had just ended. The United Nations was being built up. But remember that Felipe Padilla de Leon he saw all these ruins around him. And so I think it also expressed his desire for a peaceful world coming out of the war. So it was in a way his own sentiment to have a world without war, and it happened to become a Christmas carol that we're all familiar with nowadays. Another thing, in fact, in San Pedro composed sa Ugoy ng Duyan during the war as well. He did not put the words yet. That came after the war. But in his spare time in Angono, he saw the tranquility of the province, the lake, and all of that, and he composed sa Ugoy ng Duyan. So after the war, it comes out as a more formal piece. But its inspiration was during the Japanese occupation.
We have enough time for one last question. Would anybody like to take it from the on-site audience? Yes, the woman in the blue shirt at the back.
Hello, I'm Blue Tanko, City Style Magazine. Sir, I would like to know, after the Japanese period, Emi Muji III came, and Lito Molina, And so they came rise until about 60s and then 80s, of course, and Ato, the blind pianist, right? But unfortunately, and then the singers came, like Jackie Magno, Bernie Barga, you know, and there were places like Birds of the Same Feathers. But unfortunately now, some of our jazz singers and Lito Molina and Emmy are already heaven bound. You know, so how do you see now jazz getting to involve now in this century, 2020, 2023 and beyond? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Basically, I think what should be done is to make people more aware of the genre, jazz. We're more familiar with things like hip-hop and things like that, no? But actually, jazz is something entirely different. And it's something that Filipinos can very easily relate to, and that we have the talent for it. Unfortunately, many of our jazz greats have not been given very much justice, or have not really been given too much recognition. Even the College of Music in UP for a while downplayed jazz. Remember, there's that schism between the formal music and the popular or the sin music type of thing. UP has a jazz band, but it doesn't quite fit into the conventional part of music. But they had very good jazz players there. And I think it is important to make people aware that this exists. It is actually time immemorial, and that we had these greats before, and that we should celebrate them in the same way that we celebrate other composers and artists. So it is something that definitely has to be better known. And I think given the status, the situation that we have now of social media and so forth, there's a very good opportunity to make it better known. So I've known some of them, but again, yeah, it's something that has to be better known. Even in the 21st century, I think it's something that will continue to live.
And that brings us to the end of our Q&A. Thank you again, Doc Rico, for your presentation. And for graciously extending the Q&A session. And we also want to thank our audience, both on-site and online, for your participation. The second part of Jeepney Jazz allows you to experience the music that was discussed today, all with a Filipino flavor. If you enjoyed today's free talk, please follow FHL's social media pages for updates, as well as Ayala Foundation and the Ayala Museum. You can find us on Facebook, X, Instagram, and YouTube. We would also like to give a special mention and thanks to our main sponsor for this event, Purefoods Deli. The Ayala Museum and Filipinas Heritage Library are open to visitors and researchers. To book a visit or to learn about upcoming programs, go to ayalamuseum.org and filipinaslibrary.org.ph. Again, thank you everyone for joining us.